When Serena Stanhope walked down the aisle in 1993, the world saw a fairy tale union, but in reality she was stepping directly into a blast zone. She wasn't just marrying the Queen's nephew, she was stepping into one of the most emotionally damaged corners of the House of Windsor, where old wounds and loyalties made every family gathering feel like a ceasefire rather than a celebration. Before she ever set foot in Kensington Palace, the stage for her tragedy had already been set by the highly public, alcohol-fueled breakdown of Princess Margaret and Lord Snowdon's marriage, a legacy of cruelty that had shattered their son long before Serena arrived. For 3 decades, Serena tried to be the antidote to this radioactive history. She became the silent sandbag holding back the floodwaters of dynastic trauma, nursing a dying princess and managing a husband who had learned to survive by shutting down his soul. This is not a story about a royal marriage. It is the autopsy of a survival mission, revealing how a woman of immense strength tried to fix the unfixable, only to discover that in the end, the safest way to live with the Snowdon legacy was simply to walk away. In the 1960s and 70s, Apartment 1A at Kensington Palace was not a home. It was a theater of cruelty. It was the epicenter of the Margaret and Tony show, a household remembered for smashed crockery, withering insults, and psychological warfare that former staff later described as genuinely intimidating. Princess Margaret, the Queen's sister, was a woman trapped in the amber of her own royal status, demanding, imperious, and profoundly bored. She medicated her existence with famous grouse whiskey and a razor-sharp wit that she wielded like a scalpel. Lord Snowdon, her husband, was a brilliant bohemian photographer with a sadistic streak. He resented her rank as much as he enjoyed the privileges it brought. He would leave notes tucked into her books titled 20 Reasons Why I Hate You. He would mock her figure, her intelligence, and her friends. Growing up in this crossfire was David Armstrong-Jones. Born in 1961, David was the silent witness to the carnage. While his parents threw dinner parties that started with champagne and ended with screaming matches, David learned the art of invisibility. He learned that the only way to survive in a house dominated by 2 narcissists was to be the good boy, the quiet one, the buffer zone. He developed a coping mechanism that would define his entire adult life: compartmentalization. He built walls in his mind just as he would later build furniture with his hands. He learned to shut down his emotional receptors, to smile pleasantly while the world burned down around him. He became a man who craved order, precision, and silence, the exact opposites of his parents' chaotic existence. By the time David reached his 30s, he was a successful furniture designer, catering to the newly rich and the old aristocracy. He was the sensible royal, the one who worked for a living, the one who didn't cause scandals. But beneath the polished veneer of the Viscount Linley lay a deep, unaddressed reservoir of trauma. To many who knew him, he seemed to be searching for someone who could offer the stability his mother never managed to provide, a woman who could build a fortress of calm where he might finally rest. He wasn't looking for a princess. He was looking for an anchor. If David was the product of a royal hurricane, Serena was the product of a long, golden English summer afternoon. Born in Limerick, Ireland, in 1970, she was the daughter of Viscount Petersham, Charles Stanhope, who would later become the 12th Earl of Harrington, and his wife, Virginia Freeman Jackson. Her background was impeccably aristocratic, arguably even more secure in its identity than the Windsors, who, for all their crowns, were always anxious about their popularity and their German roots. The Stanhopes were landed gentry, old money, deeply rooted in the soil of the British countryside. Their wealth was estimated at £250 million, derived from prime London real estate in Chelsea and Kensington. They didn't need to shout about their status. It was simply there, like the oak trees on their estates. Serena grew up in a world of quiet privilege that is almost impossible to replicate today. It was a world of muddy boots, horses, finishing schools, and a distinct lack of hysteria. She was educated at St. Mary's School in Wantage, an institution designed to turn out capable, discreet wives for the upper classes. She was not an it girl in the loud, desperate manner of the 1990s social climbers. She didn't fall out of nightclubs. She didn't sell stories to the tabloids. She was possessed of a natural, statuesque beauty, blonde, cool, and poised, that reminded older courtiers of Grace Kelly. But there was more to Serena than just good breeding. She had a spine of steel. Growing up in a wealthy family comes with its own pressures, but Serena navigated them with a serene confidence. She studied art in Italy. She worked at Sotheby's. She had her own life, her own money, and her own mind. When she met David Armstrong-Jones in the early 1990s, she wasn't looking for a title. She already had one. She wasn't looking for money. She had plenty. She was looking for a partner. The meeting of David and Serena was seen by the establishment as a perfect match. On paper, it was dynastic glue, the Queen's nephew marrying the Earl's daughter. It was safe, it was appropriate, but the chemistry between them was rooted in something deeper than class. David was drawn to Serena's stillness. She was the antidote to the Snowdon noise. When he was with her, he didn't have to perform. He didn't have to manage his mother's moods or his father's snipes. He could just be David. Serena, in turn, was charmed by David's creativity and his vulnerability. She saw the boy hiding behind the businessman. She saw the wounds that his impeccable manners tried to conceal. She fell in love with his need for her. There's a seductive power in being the strong one in a relationship, the person who holds the keys to peace. From the outside, it is tempting to see Serena as the classic 23-year-old optimist who thought stability and love might soothe the wounds left by Princess Margaret and Lord Snowdon. But to marry David, Serena had to pass the ultimate test. She had to survive the scrutiny of the in-laws from hell. Princess Margaret in the early 1990s was a lion in winter. Her health was failing. Decades of chain-smoking 60 cigarettes a day and drinking heavy spirits had ravaged her system. But her capacity for intimidation was undiminished. She was a woman who had been disappointed by life, by love, and by her own diminishing relevance. She took out her frustrations on those closest to her. She was known to terrorize her children's partners, dismissing them with a cold stare or a withering comment about their breeding or their dress sense. When David brought Serena to Kensington Palace to meet Margot, the atmosphere must have been thick with tension. The apartment was a time capsule of the 1960s, filled with smoke, servants, and the heavy, suffocating weight of royal protocol. Margaret would have been seated, perhaps with a cigarette holder, analyzing this young girl from the Shires. Serena passed. In fact, she did more than pass. She disarmed the dragon. Margaret liked her. Perhaps she recognized a fellow aristocrat who understood the unspoken codes of their class. Perhaps she saw in Serena's calm demeanor a reflection of the Queen, her sister, whom she adored and envied in equal measure. Or perhaps, in her declining years, Margaret simply realized that her son needed a caretaker, and Serena looked like she was up to the job. But being liked by Princess Margaret was a double-edged sword. It was not a ticket to freedom. It was a conscription notice. By accepting Serena, Margaret was, intentionally or not, drawing her into the emotional service of the family. Serena would become not just a daughter-in-law, but also a companion and listener during the princess's increasingly difficult final years. Serena was being invited into the inner sanctum, without yet seeing that it was a room that would be far easier to enter than to leave. Then there was Lord Snowdon. Tony Armstrong-Jones was divorced from Margaret, but he loomed over David's life like a dark colossus. He was charming, seductive, and dangerous. He could be delightful one minute and devastatingly critical the next. He had a complicated personal life. He had remarried, divorced again, and was followed by rumors of other children and other lovers. Serena had to navigate this relationship with extreme caution. Snowdon had a low tolerance for anything he considered boring or conventional. He viewed women through the lens of a photographer, as objects of beauty to be arranged and critiqued. Serena, with her quiet elegance, had to earn his respect without becoming his target. She had to prove that she wasn't just a posh girl, but a woman of substance. The complexity of the family dynamic was staggering. David was loyal to both parents, yet both parents hated each other. Serena had to be the diplomat, walking a tightrope between Margaret's Kensington Palace and Snowdon's studio. She had to listen to Margaret complain about Tony and listen to Tony mock Margaret, all while maintaining a neutral, supportive expression. She was training for a marathon of emotional labor. The engagement was announced in May 1993. The ring was a diamond solitaire, flanked by two smaller diamonds, classic and understated, much like Serena herself. The press went wild. After the disasters of the Annus Horribilis in 1992, the year Charles and Diana separated, Anne divorced, Andrew separated, and Windsor Castle burned down, the monarchy was desperate for good news. David and Serena were the saviors. They were the safe royals. They were the proof that the younger generation wasn't entirely accursed. The wedding took place on October 8th, 1993, at St. Margaret's Church in Westminster. It was the society wedding of the decade. The guest list was a roll call of the British establishment: the Queen Mother, Princess Diana, looking sad and isolated, sitting apart from the main family block, Prince Charles, and the glitterati of London. Serena's dress was a masterpiece of 1950s-inspired couture designed by Bruce Robbins. It was said to be a tribute to Princess Margaret's own wedding dress from 1960, a gesture of deference and respect that surely pleased her mother-in-law. Serena looked radiant, composed, and impossibly young. David looked relieved. He had done it. He had found the one woman who could fit into his impossible life. But there was a shadow over the proceedings. As the couple stood at the altar exchanging vows, the physical arrangement of the guests told the real story. Princess Margaret and Lord Snowdon sat on opposite sides of the aisle, separated by a demilitarized zone of cold air. They barely looked at each other. Their bitterness was a physical presence in the church, a ghost at the feast. For Serena, standing there in her white silk, this should have been a moment of pure joy. But underneath the adrenaline, there must have been a flicker of realization. She wasn't just marrying David, she was marrying them. She was marrying the history, the feuds, the secrets, and the silence. She was marrying into a family where love was often a weapon, and where duty was the excuse for emotional neglect. As they walked out of the church into the autumn sunshine, the crowds cheered. It looked like the beginning of a fairy tale, but fairy tales usually end at the wedding. In the House of Windsor, the wedding is just the prologue. The real story, the story of endurance, of compromise, and of the slow erosion of the self was just beginning. Serena Stanhope had stepped onto the board, but she didn't yet know the rules of the game. She didn't know that in this particular game, even when you win, you lose a piece of yourself. She drove away with David in an open-top Aston Martin, waving to the cameras, the picture of the perfect royal bride. But as the car turned the corner and the cheers faded, she was left with the man beside her. A man who loved her, yes, but who was also a man composed of scar tissue. She had signed a contract for life, unaware that the terms and conditions included managing the decline of a dynasty and absorbing the pain of a husband who had never learned how to cry. But the honeymoon was brief, and the reality of the decade they had just entered was unforgiving. As the Aston Martin faded from view, the couple did not drive off into a quiet sunset. They drove straight into the teeth of the most turbulent era the monarchy had faced in a century. The 1990s were waiting to devour the Windsors, and while the rest of the family would soon be consumed by fire and scandal, David and Serena were tasked with a different, perhaps heavier, burden. They had to be the anchor that held fast while the rest of the ship went down. As the 1990s progressed, the House of Windsor began to resemble a burning building. The marriage of Charles and Diana disintegrated in a spectacular serialized public humiliation that dominated the global news cycle. Prince Andrew and Sarah Ferguson separated amidst toe-sucking scandals. Princess Anne divorced. And then, in 1992, Windsor Castle literally caught fire, sending plumes of smoke into the sky that served as a grim metaphor for the state of the monarchy. The institution was trembling. The public was furious. The mystique was evaporating. Yet, amidst this carnage, there was one corner of the royal map that remained stubbornly, almost aggressively, perfect: the household of David and Serena Armstrong-Jones. They established themselves in the affluent, leafy enclave of Chelsea, far enough away from the goldfish bowl of the palaces to maintain a semblance of privacy, but close enough to remain within the gravitational pull of the court. To the outside world, they were the cool royals. They were the antidote to the hysteria of the Waleses. David was the industrious artisan, the man with sawdust on his suits who was building a furniture empire. Linley, that catered to the tastes of oligarchs, rock stars, and the new aristocracy of money. Serena was the elegant châtelaine, opening her own boutique, Serena Linley Provence, which sold lavender-scented soaps and impeccable linens. They were young, they were beautiful, and most importantly, they were functional. The press loved them because they were boring in the best possible way. There were no leaked tapes, there were no tears on television, there was only the image of a handsome couple riding bicycles, attending gallery openings, and looking at each other with genuine affection. They represented the future the Queen had hoped for, a monarchy that worked for a living, that had real jobs and real lives. But this stability was a curated performance, a veneer as polished and thin as the marquetry on one of David's 50,000-pound desks. Serena had not just married a man, she had married a crisis management role. While the cameras focused on their success, the private reality of their lives was dominated by the slow, agonizing, and demanding decline of the family matriarch. Without ever being formally asked, Serena slid into the role that every royal family quietly relies on: the good daughter-in-law who absorbs the admin, the small talk, and the emotional weather of an aging matriarch. The princess was not an easy invalid. She did not go gently into that good night. She remained imperious, demanding the same deference in her sickness as she had in her health. She could be acerbic, snapping at staff and family alike. Yet, with Serena, she often softened. There was a mutual respect there. Serena didn't fawn over her, but she didn't ignore her either. She treated Margaret with a dignity that many others, exhausted by the drama, had stopped offering. There are stories of Christmas at Sandringham during these years, where the tension would be palpable. The Queen would be worrying about the state of the country. The younger royals would be worrying about the paparazzi. And in the corner, Serena would be sitting with Margaret, pouring her drink, listening to the same stories about the 1950s for the 100th time, acting as the lightning rod for the princess's frustration so that David wouldn't have to. Into this atmosphere of high-functioning caretaking, the next generation arrived. In 1999, Serena gave birth to their son, Charles Armstrong-Jones, now Viscount Linley. In 2002, their daughter Margarita Armstrong-Jones was born. The arrival of children usually changes the dynamic of a family, shifting the focus from the past to the future. But in the Snowdon clan, the past was a heavy anchor. David was determined to give his children the stability he never had. He wanted a home where doors weren't slammed, where parents didn't leave hate notes for each other. He wanted peace. Serena was the architect of this peace. She created a nursery world that was protected from the darker currents of the family history. She ensured that Charles and Margarita knew their grandmother, but she also filtered the experience. They saw Granny Margot, the lady who loved to sing at the piano and smoke cigarettes, not the tragic, bitter figure the world saw. Serena curated the memories for her children, preserving the best of the lineage while shielding them from the toxicity. But maintaining this firewall required immense energy. Serena was essentially living two lives: the normal, upper-class mother running the school run and the shop, and the royal caretaker managing the decline of a dynasty. She was the bridge between the ordinary and the extraordinary, and bridges bear the weight of all the traffic. While Margaret was fading, Lord Snowdon was still very much alive and still very much Snowdon. Anthony Armstrong-Jones remained a complex, often difficult presence in their lives. He was a man who demanded excellence and withheld praise as a control mechanism. He was charming, seductive, and famously critical. David's relationship with his father was fraught with the desire for approval. He had followed in his father's footsteps as a creator, a man who worked with his hands and his eye. But Snowdon was a hard master. He could look at a piece of furniture David had spent months perfecting and point out the single flaw in seconds. Serena had to navigate this minefield as well. She had to be the diplomat between father and son. She had to host the dinners where Snowdon would hold court, being brilliant and biting, while David often shrank back into the role of the dutiful son. She had to ensure that the grandchildren had a relationship with their grandfather, despite his history of neglect. And there were secrets. The rumor of Polly Fry, the daughter Snowdon had fathered just before marrying Margaret, was always there, a low hum in the background of their lives. Though it wouldn't be publicly confirmed with a DNA test until 2008, the family knew, or suspected. Serena was living in a house where the walls were papered over with lies and half-truths. She was raising her children in a family tree that was twisted and gnarled, trying to convince them it was straight. The precarious balance that Serena had maintained for nearly a decade collapsed in 2002. It was the year the dam broke. February 2002. Princess Margaret died in her sleep after suffering another massive stroke. She was 71. For David, this was the severing of the primary cord of his life. He had spent 40 years worrying about her, protecting her, and being defined by her. Now she was gone. The grief was profound, but it was also complicated by relief, and by the terrifying realization that he was now the custodian of her memory. Serena stood by him at the funeral in St. George's Chapel. She looked impeccable in black, the perfect supportive wife. But she must have known that the death of the matriarch would not simplify their lives, it would complicate them. Death in the royal family is an administrative event. It involves wills, estates, taxes, and the redistribution of history. And then just 7 weeks later, the Queen Mother died. The double blow was catastrophic for the family. David had lost the two women who had been the poles of his existence: his mother, the chaotic fire, and his grandmother, the steady earth. He was unmoored. The grief pushed David further into his work. He became even more obsessed with Linley, with expansion, with success. It was a classic Snowdon coping mechanism. When feelings get too big, make things. Control the material world because the emotional world is uncontrollable. Serena was left to manage the emotional fallout at home. She had to explain death to a 3-year-old and a newborn. She had to support a husband who was disappearing into his grief and his workshop. She had to navigate the complex probate issues that arose from Margaret's estate. It was during this period that the cracks in the golden couple facade began to form. They were microscopic at first, invisible to the naked eye, but they were there. The shared mission of caring for Margot was over. The enemy, illness and decline, had won. Now they were just a husband and wife staring at each other across a void, wondering what their purpose was now that the crisis had passed. The aftermath of Margaret's death brought a new crisis, one that would test Serena's loyalty and her stomach for public scrutiny. Princess Margaret had left an estate worth roughly £20 million, but she had also left a massive tax bill. The inheritance tax in the UK is punitive, 40%. To pay the bill and secure the financial future of his children, David made a decision that shocked the establishment. He decided to sell his mother's things. In 2006, Christie's announced the auction of the collection of Her Royal Highness, the Princess Margaret. It was a fire sale of royal history. Everything was on the block. The Poltimore tiara she wore on her wedding day, the Fabergé clocks, the furniture, the jewelry, even small, intimate items that felt too personal to sell. The public reaction was mixed. Some saw it as a pragmatic necessity. Others saw it as a vulgar cash grab, a son selling off his mother's memory. For someone like Serena, raised to value discretion and to avoid discussing money in public, watching it unfold must have been deeply uncomfortable. Yet she stood by David. She understood the financial reality. They were minor royals without a civil list income. They had to pay their own way. But the auction was more than a financial transaction. It was a psychological exorcism. David was dismantling the shrine. He was clearing out the physical weight of his childhood. He was trying to turn the heavy, suffocating legacy of Margaret and Tony into liquid cash, something clean, neutral, and usable. Serena helped him organize it. She watched as the tiara she had seen on her mother-in-law's head was hammered down for £926,400. She watched as the artifacts of her marriage's history were scattered to the winds, bought by collectors in Hong Kong and New York. It was a cleansing fire, but it left the house empty. As the mid-2000s turned into the 2000s, the drama subsided. The debts were paid. The ghosts were buried or sold. The children were in school. The business was thriving. David became the chairman of Christie's UK, a position of immense prestige. Serena retreated from her business, closing her shop in 2010 to focus on the family and her charitable interests. They had achieved the goal. They were successful, wealthy, and respected. They seemed for a time to have outrun whatever people meant when they spoke of a Snowdon curse. But peace is a dangerous thing for a man raised in war. Without the constant adrenaline of managing his mother or proving himself to his father, David became restless. He traveled constantly. He was a man in motion, a shark that had to keep swimming to breathe. He was charming, he was brilliant, but he was increasingly absent. Serena found herself in the position of the waiting wife. She spent more time at the Stanhope family seat or their home in Provence. She curated a beautiful life, but she was often living it alone. The partnership that had been forged in the fire of family crisis was cooling in the air of stability. They had become parallel lines, running in the same direction, perfectly aligned, but never touching. The intimacy had been eroded by duty. They had spent so much time being the perfect couple for the benefit of the monarchy and the public that they had forgotten how to be a couple for themselves. David was his father's son in more ways than one. He had the Armstrong-Jones charm, but also the Armstrong-Jones detachment. He compartmentalized his wife just as he compartmentalized his grief. She was part of the home sector, to be visited and admired, but not necessarily engaged with on a deep soul-bearing level. Serena, with her Irish blood and her Stanhope spine, was not a woman to be compartmentalized forever. She had done her service. She had walked through the fire. She began to look at the next 20 years of her life and wonder if she wanted to spend them waiting for a husband who was married to his furniture. The golden couple was tarnishing, not from scandal, but from neglect. The house in Chelsea, once a fortress against the world, was becoming a gilded cage of its own, and Serena, who had once held the keys to the family's sanity, was beginning to realize that the only way to unlock the door was to leave. Yet inertia is a powerful force, and a marriage can survive on the fumes of duty for a very long time, provided the external structures remain intact. For David and Serena, the final structural pillar was the patriarch himself. As long as Lord Snowdon was alive, the old battles were still being fought in the psyche, and the old alliances held firm. But time was preparing to remove the last great antagonist from the stage, and with his departure, the tension that had kept the family wire taut would suddenly go slack, revealing just how far apart the couple had actually drifted. January 2017 brought a chill to London that seemed to seep into the very stones of Kensington. On the 13th of the month, Anthony Armstrong-Jones, the first Earl of Snowdon, died peacefully at his home at the age of 86. For the world, it was the passing of a legendary photographer and a royal rebel. For David Armstrong-Jones, it was the end of the defining relationship of his life. The death of a difficult parent is a complex trauma. It is not just grief, it is a strange, disorienting release. For 55 years, David had lived in the shadow of his father's brilliance and his father's cruelty. He had built his own career, his own reputation, and his own family, largely as a response to Tony, trying to earn the respect of a man who was incapable of giving it unconditionally. With Snowdon gone, the tension that had held David's psyche taut for decades suddenly snapped. The audience was gone. The performance was over. Serena stood by him at the funeral, now bearing the title of Countess of Snowdon. She looked every inch the part, dignified, supportive, the perfect aristocrat. But beneath the black veil, the dynamic of their marriage was shifting tectonically. For 20 years, their union had been defined by a shared mission, surviving his parents. They had been comrades in the trenches of the Snowdon War. Now, the war was over. The last enemy had died, and without the external threat to bind them together, they were forced to look at what remained between them. David inherited the title, becoming the second Earl of Snowdon. It was a heavy crown. The title carried with it the legacy of the swinger photographer and the royal rebel. But David was neither of those things. He was a businessman, a craftsman, a man of order. He threw himself into his work with a ferocity that bordered on the pathological. He was not just running Lindley Furniture, he was the honorary chairman of Christie's in Europe, the Middle East, Russia, and India. He was a man in constant motion, traveling incessantly, selling, charming, working. This workaholism was a classic Snowdon coping mechanism. If you keep moving, the feelings can't catch you. But it left Serena alone in the vast, quiet rooms of their life. The children, Charles and Margarita, were growing up and leaving the nest. The project of raising them was nearing completion. Serena found herself in the role of the waiting wife, a role she had seen her mother-in-law, Princess Margaret, play with disastrous results. But unlike Margaret, who screamed for attention, Serena simply retreated into silence. She had closed her shop, Serena Linley Provence, in 2014. It had been her passion project, her slice of independence. With that gone, and her husband absent, her world shrank. She spent more time at her family's estates reconnecting with the Stanhope roots that had always been her source of strength. She was slowly, quietly detaching herself from the Snowdon orbit. The separation did not happen with a bang. There were no paparazzi photos of moving vans, no rumors of affairs with polo players or actresses. It was a conscious uncoupling long before the term was invented. It was an erosion. It was the realization that they were living parallel lives that no longer intersected. David was increasingly wedded to his legacy. Serena, meanwhile, found herself living with the ghosts that legacy had left behind. The intimacy had evaporated, replaced by a polite administrative partnership. They were excellent co-parents, excellent executors of the estate, excellent representatives of the crown, but they were no longer husband and wife in any meaningful sense. By 2019, the decision had been made with the cool pragmatism that defined them both. They would divorce, but they would do it the Linley way, without drama, without leaks, and without damaging the Queen. The timing of the public announcement on February 17, 2020, was an accidental masterstroke of burying bad news. The British monarchy was already facing its biggest existential crisis since the death of Diana. Prince Harry and Meghan Markle had just dropped the nuclear bomb of Megxit, and the palaces were in chaos. In the middle of this hurricane, the brief statement confirming the end of the Snowdon marriage was barely a blip on the radar. The world was too busy dissecting Meghan's wardrobe to notice that the perfect royal marriage had quietly collapsed. But to the insiders, and reportedly to the Queen herself, the shock was profound. It felt like the final fraying of the old order, the last link to the Margaret era, snapping under the strain of the modern world. In the middle of this hurricane on February 17, 2020, a brief statement was released. The Earl and Countess of Snowdon have amicably agreed that their marriage has come to an end and that they shall be divorced. They ask that the press respect their privacy and that of their family. It was barely a blip on the radar. The world was too busy dissecting Meghan's wardrobe, and Harry's anger to notice that the perfect royal marriage had quietly collapsed. But to the insiders, the shock was profound. David and Serena were the stalwarts. They were the ones who stayed. If they couldn't make it work, who could? The Queen was reportedly sad but pragmatic about the split, according to contemporary press coverage. David was widely seen as one of her closest nephews, and Serena had been a reassuringly discreet presence in the family orbit for more than 2 decades. Their divorce felt like the final fraying of the old order, the last link to the Margaret era, snapping under the strain of the modern world. As the paperwork was filed, a strange calm descended on Serena. She had done her duty. She had walked into the most damaged room in the House of Windsor, tidied up the mess, nursed the sick, buried the dead, and raised the heirs. She had paid the Snowdon tax in full. The divorce wasn't a failure. It was a completion of a contract. She had served her time in the royal trenches. Now, as she approached her 50th birthday, she was granting herself a discharge. She was walking away from the title, the history, and the ghosts. She was reclaiming Serena Stanhope. The timing of the divorce announcement in February 2020 was a dark little gift. Within weeks, the COVID-19 pandemic had shut down London, silencing the gossip columns and emptying the streets. The personal isolation Serena had sought was suddenly mirrored by a global lockdown, giving the couple a strange, suspended pocket of time to dismantle their marriage out of the spotlight. Serena retreated further into the Stanhope sphere of influence, spending time at her family's estates in the country. It was a return to the source. Away from the heavy, history-laden air of Kensington and Chelsea, she began to reconstruct an identity that wasn't defined by the Snowdon legacy. She was no longer the peacekeeper. She was simply Serena. David, meanwhile, remained in the capital, a man who seemed unable to stop moving even when the world had ground to a halt. And it wasn't long before the vacuum left by Serena was filled. By 2022, rumors began to swirl that the Earl of Snowdon had found a new companion. Her name was Isabelle de la Bruyère, a glamorous French art expert and CEO of a major gallery group. The contrast was striking and painful. David had replaced an English aristocrat with a French sophisticate, swapping the quiet stability of the shires for the high-octane energy of the international art market. It was a return to form for a man raised by Serena Armstrong-Jones, a gravitation toward the dazzling, the worldly, and the new. For Serena, watching from the sidelines, it must have been a confirmation of her redundancy. The role of Earl's wife had been recast, and the production was moving on without her. But the final, definitive severing of the tie came not from the divorce courts, but from Balmoral Castle. On September 8th, 2022, Queen Elizabeth II died. For the nation, it was the end of an era. For David Armstrong-Jones, it was the loss of his second mother, the aunt who had been the constant, benevolent presence in his fractured life. For Serena, it felt like the loss of perhaps her strongest ally at court. Many observers believe the Queen respected her stoicism and recognized in her niece-in-law a version of her own quiet commitment to duty and endurance. With the Queen gone, the last protective umbrella over the Snowdon branch of the family was folded away. The funeral of Queen Elizabeth II was a moment of supreme theater, and Serena Armstrong-Jones was there. She walked into Westminster Abbey dressed in mourning black, a figure of solitary dignity. She was there as the mother of the Queen's great-nephew, but she was also there as a ghost of the family's past. She sat near the center of power, yet she was no longer of it. The cameras caught fleeting glimpses of her, calm, composed, unreadable. She was witnessing the burial of the world she had married into. The old royal world of silence, discretion, and stiff upper lips was being lowered into the vault at Windsor, replaced by the new, noisier, more emotionally volatile era of King Charles III. Serena belonged to the old world. Her exit from the stage felt synchronized with the Queen's passing. As the parents moved apart, the spotlight shifted to the children, the first generation of Snowdons to grow up without the immediate terror of Princess Margaret's moods. Charles Armstrong-Jones, Viscount Linley, and Lady Margarita Armstrong-Jones emerged from the cocoon of their protected childhoods into the glare of adult life. Charles, the heir, chose a path of quiet diligence. He studied product design engineering, following in his father's footsteps, but with a lower profile. He is a musician, a maker, a young man who seems to have inherited the artistic talent of the Armstrong-Jones line without the destructive narcissism. Margarita, however, stepped into the light, a jewelry designer and photographer. She carries the physical imprint of her grandmother, the same petite frame, the same sparkle. At the coronation of King Charles III in 2023, she was photographed wearing a chic couture outfit, looking every inch the modern royal. But there was a detail that spoke volumes. On her finger, she wore Princess Margaret's engagement ring, the ruby and diamond cluster designed by Serena Armstrong-Jones to look like a rosebud. It was a stunning act of reclamation. That ring had been a symbol of a doomed marriage, a token from a relationship that became emotionally devastating. By wearing it, Margarita was, consciously or not, rewriting the narrative, turning what many saw as a cursed object into a piece of fashion, showing that the weight of the past could be worn more lightly instead of carried as a lifelong burden. Serena had done her job. She had raised children who could look the past in the eye without blinking. She had filtered the poison out of the bloodstream so that the next generation could be healthy. She does not give interviews. She does not host charity galas. She does not merchandise her title. She has simply stepped back into the anonymity of the ultra-rich. This silence is her final act of service to the crown, but it is also her final act of self-preservation. For someone as private as Serena, speaking publicly would risk dragging old ghosts back into the room, forcing her to acknowledge wounds she has preferred to keep hidden. And Serena Stanhope, true to her upbringing, has chosen not to complain in public. She lives a life of comfortable obscurity, splitting her time between her properties, surrounded by her dogs and her old friends. She is a woman who walked through fire and came out the other side smelling of lavender soap. She survived the Armstrong-Jones circus, but she did not buy a ticket for the sequel. As David parades his new life and his new love in the art galleries of Mayfair, Serena remains in the country. It is a quiet victory. She has reclaimed the one thing that years of royal proximity seemed to erode more than anything else, her peace. With the Queen gone and the marriage dissolved, Serena Stanhope found herself standing at a crossroads that few royal ex-wives ever navigate successfully. To her left was the path of the royal victim, the lucrative, noisy road of tell-all books and reality TV contracts that had seduced so many others. To her right was the path of the ghost, total erasure. But Serena, utilizing the steel will she had hidden for decades, chose a third way. She decided to remain visible but silent, present but untouchable, turning her refusal to speak into the loudest statement of all. In a culture where every royal relative seems to have a book deal or a podcast, Serena's continued refusal to speak has become its own quiet manifesto. Her silence doesn't feel like shyness. It feels like a deliberate refusal to turn pain into content. She is the kind of woman who would know almost everything. After nearly 30 years inside the blast radius of the Snowdon marriage, she would have seen the private disintegration of the Queen's sister and heard more than most about the secret daughter rumors, the Christmas tensions, and the money worries that swirl behind palace walls. A publisher would pay handsomely for her story. A candid memoir from the Countess of Snowdon would be explosive reading. Unlike Meghan, she wasn't an outsider looking in, but a long-term insider, quietly fixing problems and watching the family from a front row seat. But the book does not exist, and judging by her rigid commitment to privacy so far, it's very unlikely ever to appear. Serena's refusal to speak is the final defining masterstroke of her life. By staying silent, she retains her power. If she were to speak, she would risk becoming just another character in the soap opera, another bitter ex trading dignity for cash. By saying nothing, she stays above the fray, an aristocratic sphinx who refuses to be consumed by the voracious public appetite for royal pain. Her choices hint at a belief the younger generation of royals often seems to ignore, that the only way to truly win this particular game is to play it, if at all, strictly on your own terms. If Serena has a legacy, it is not found in the furniture business she helped build or the title she held. It is found in her children. Charles and Margarita Armstrong-Jones are the first generation of the Snowdon line to emerge from childhood without the visible scars of psychological warfare. Charles, the young earl, is a figure of quiet industry. He has followed his father and grandfather into the world of design and engineering, studying at Loughborough University and working as a musician. But he lacks the desperate, performative neediness of Lord Snowdon. He does not need to humiliate others to feel big. He does not need to be the center of attention. He is a young man who seems comfortable in his own skin, a trait that was entirely absent in his father and grandfather at the same age. Margarita is the blossoming star of the family. She has inherited the physical glamour of Princess Margaret, the petite frame, the dazzling smile, but she carries it with a lightness that Margaret never possessed. She works in jewelry design and photography, reclaiming the family trades but stripping them of their toxicity. When she appears on the cover of Tatler or walks in a fashion show, she does so with a sense of joy, not entitlement. This is Serena's masterpiece. She broke the chain. She absorbed the trauma of the previous generation, the addiction, the ego, the neglect, and she filtered as much of it as she could out of the water supply before it reached her children. She acted as a human shield, taking the emotional hits so that Charles and Margarita could grow up far more whole than their grandparents did. In the grand, tragic history of the House of Windsor, where trauma so often seems to pass down like a hereditary flaw that looks like a victory of heroic proportions, her story suggests that nurture can, at least sometimes, blunt the force of nature when the parent is strong enough to hold the line. Today, Serena Armstrong-Jones lives a life that is almost aggressively private. She splits her time between London and the countryside, moving through the world like a ghost in cashmere. She is no longer a royal highness by marriage, though she retains her title, and she is no longer a Snowdon in spirit. She has reverted to the Stanhope archetype, the landed aristocrat who values dogs, gardens, and old friends over red carpets and flashbulbs. There is a melancholy to her position, certainly. To be a divorced woman in her 50s in high society is to occupy a strange, often invisible space. The invitations change, the seating plans shift, but for Serena, this invisibility is likely a relief. She spent 3 decades being on, managing David's moods, managing Margaret's pain, managing the public perception of a broken family. Now, she is off the clock. She is often seen walking in Chelsea or in the Cotswolds, usually alone or with a close circle of female friends who have protected her privacy with the ferocity of a Praetorian guard. She looks younger than her years, her face unlined by the bitterness that ravaged her mother-in-law. She looks like a woman who has put down a heavy load and is still getting used to the feeling of walking upright. The story of Serena Armstrong-Jones is a modern Greek tragedy with a quiet British ending. She was the Iphigenia of the Windsors, the sacrifice offered up to try and appease the angry spirits of the Snowdon marriage. She gave her youth, her energy, and her heart to the task of fixing a family that was fundamentally unfixable. She failed to save the marriage, but she succeeded in saving herself. Her life serves as a brutal critique of the fairy tale. We are taught that marrying a prince or a viscount is the ultimate happy ending. Serena's life shows us the fine print of that contract. It shows us that proximity to the crown is a form of radiation. It burns everyone who gets too close. It shows us that the glamour of royalty is often just a high-gloss paint used to cover up the rot of emotional neglect. But her story is also one of profound resilience. She walked through the fire and didn't burn. She didn't drown herself in drink, ego, or compulsive work in the way so many people around her had. She remained stubbornly and improbably Serena. Imagine her on a quiet Tuesday afternoon in late autumn. She is at her country estate, The trees are turning gold, shedding their leaves, preparing for the winter. The noise of London is far away. The noise of the royal family, the headlines, the coronations, the scandals, is just a distant hum on the television she rarely turns on. She is in the garden, pruning roses. It is a cliché, perhaps, but fitting. Gardening requires patience. It requires the ability to cut away the dead wood so that the new growth can survive. It is a solitary act of hope. She cuts a dead stem, the snap of the shears echoing in the silence. She looks up at the gray English sky. She is alone. She is no longer the peacekeeper, the buffer, or the wife. She is just a woman in a garden, breathing her own air, living a life that finally, after 30 years of service to the ghosts of others, belongs entirely to her. The gate is closed. The fortress is secure. And for the first time in her life, the silence isn't heavy. It is light.